They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And so that sets the stage. They've left Egypt. We covered already the parting of the Red Sea and all that stuff in God's deliverance from Egypt. They have left Egypt. They have gone out to Sinai at this point, and they are now in the wilderness, which it says is between Elim and Sinai. The people of Israel said to them, that's Moses and Aaron, because it says in verse 2 that they grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." First observation, these people were very melodramatic. I'm not real sure how long it had been since they had eaten, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't as bad as they were painting it. And I'm also pretty sure that Egypt wasn't as good as they are painting it. Because, why did they leave Egypt again? Because they were crying about how bad they were treated. And yet, in a relatively short order, all of a sudden, hey, man, we got to sit by the meat pots and just fill our stomachs full of food. And by the way, I want to go ahead and put this in to our thoughts as we discuss all this. Words like meat, especially in the King James Version of the Bible, and words like bread do not always mean what we think of when we think of meat and bread. Sometimes they do. I think the context makes it pretty clear. Sometimes meat and bread simply stand for what? Food, sustenance. That's a figure of speech where an item stands for a whole class of things. So just understand that as we read these kinds of things, because as I talk about this, especially as we develop these ideas later, as we get away from this, and even to some extent this morning, I think we'll get into this. I don't know what you think of when you read the word bread, but I think of a loaf of white bread from the grocery store when I read that word. That's just what comes into my mind. If I say to somebody, "Go get me some bread," that's what I'm talking about. And that's what they're understanding. And if I go to the store to buy bread, that's what I'm going to get. That's just the way we think of things. That is not what we're going to be talking about when we talk about this bread. And I don't think that's what they was talking about in verse 3 here when it says we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. I think they're just saying that we had access to food. And we had as much food as we needed. And so that's the way we need to understand this. And I think that's important when we start talking about manna. Because we do talk about the bread from heaven, but this is not what we would call bread. We would not look at a measure of manna and say, "Hey, there's some bread." That's not the way we would talk about it in English necessarily. So what that's really saying to us is what? Not the type of food it is, but what? That it was food, that it was sustenance for them, that it provided for them nourishment, the things that they needed. So just kind of keep that in mind. All right. The Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." Now, there's a couple of things about that verse that are interesting to me. Is God's ability to provide provisions for people limited to space and time? Now, we're going to find out some things that he put in place as we read through this that explains this idea of get a day's portion and all that kind of. Why did he have them do it every day? How many of you go to the grocery store every day and buy the food you need for that day? And then, do you go back the next day? Okay, there are people who do this, and I'm not making fun of them. There are people who do this that actually plan out their diets and say, okay, on Monday I'm going to eat this and this and this and this, and they schedule a trip to the store and they buy Monday's goods. That's not how we function. We got 6 people in our house, and we don't have that much time every day necessarily to do that. So we tend to go to the store once, sometimes once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and buy just as much stuff as we need and carry it all home. Now, there's even milk at my house is like that vapor that James talks about. We can buy 4 gallons of milk, and I promise it's all going before it spoils. We could buy 6 gallons of milk and be home before it spoiled, probably. It's just the way it works. So buying in bulk is not a big deal to us, and that's what we do. So why didn't God just give them enough food to feed them for a week? Right, exactly. And by the way, the reason I picked a week is because that seems to be the normal. People go to the grocery store about once a week, unless they need to pick up milk and bread and eggs and that kind of stuff especially. But generally they go to the store once a week and they buy the week's groceries. It goes back to Jesus' statement in the model prayer, give us this day our daily bread. And by the way, statement arises from the lesson that is going on right here. That what God is teaching. God is teaching them something. And by virtue of recording that, He's teaching us something. And Wesley pointed out he was trying to teach them to do what? Depend on Him. Always. Don't worry about tomorrow. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide you this day's food. You don't have to worry about tomorrow's food because guess what? I'll get you tomorrow's food. I'm going to take care of you tomorrow too. You need to trust me. And then He's going to give them some rules about how to gather it and when to gather it and what to gather and how much to gather. And by the way, to show you that time had nothing to do with it, that it wasn't something about the manna itself, whatever manna is. And for all the people out there that have read any of these commentaries or these science guys or these other people that have sat down and tried to explain what manna was, throw it all in the trash. I have no idea what it was, where it arose from. I'm pretty sure it was not physiological and natural the way some of them describe these certain kind of trees that when the dew sets on them, there's this little flaky stuff on. That's the manna, because if that was the case, we could all still go out to this same desert and live without ever needing any other food than that. That's not what it was. It wasn't something that happened naturally. It was an act of God providing sustenance for them. They were able to gather this in a particular amount. He told them specifically how much to gather, and then you get down to it, and when it comes to the Sabbath time, He's already told them you need to honor the Sabbath, and so He doesn't want them working on the Sabbath, and so rather than gathering the bread for the Sabbath, what'd they do? The day before, they got 2 days' worth, and it lasted perfectly fine. It wasn't a matter that there was something about the substance that made it spoil after 24 hours. It was a matter of God setting it up that way under these circumstances to teach them an important lesson. So we have to be looking for that lesson as we read through this. He says something interesting here. A day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. This is a test, at least this part of it is a test, to see if they'll actually listen. If they'll actually do what He said, if they'll actually... Is there anything magic about the amount? Is there anything magic about the process? No. The question is, will you listen to me and trust me? Which, by the way, we can apply to many things today. Most popular one that people object to is baptism. I don't see how baptism can have anything to do with salvation, people will say. That's not the question. Do we believe God? Do we trust God? Will we do what He's asked us to do? That's the question. That's the test. And He makes that clear here. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it in the specific way that I'm going to describe, because this is a test to see whether or not they will walk in my life. Listen, if you won't follow him on this point, you won't follow him on any point. That's why if you stumble in one point of the law, you stumble on the whole thing. If you don't respect God, you don't respect God. If I'm doing something because I believe within myself that it's something I want to do or something I need to do, that's very different than being obedient to God. There's a lot of things, I may not murder someone because I just think it's wrong to kill people. That's not necessarily obeying God. Respecting God and respecting His value for human life and respecting His ordinance to behave in a particular way, but that's why if you hate your brother, Jesus says you're already guilty of what? Of murder in your heart. Because you've missed the whole point in what God is trying to get you to do, which is to do what? We've been studying this on Wednesday nights. Please don't anybody get it wrong. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus taught that on that hung everything else. If I miss that, it doesn't matter if I tithe. I need to understand that the reason I tithe is to do what? First and foremost, to honor God. Secondly, what did the tithe get used for? Anybody know? The priests and everybody ate off all that stuff. It fed people. I need to understand that when I didn't glean the corners of my fields, I didn't harvest them so that they were available for others to glean, that the reason I don't harvest them is not because there's some kind of agricultural benefit to not harvesting all my property, but because of what? I'm providing food for people who need it. I need to understand that and understand what that means and respect God's instructions regarding those things. And so this is a test to see whether they'll obey God. Period. End of story. Not obey God in this one narrow way, but obey God at all. Do they respect? Yes, sir. Yeah. But with the parting of the sea, there was an east wind, you know. Maybe it just happened. Why did he appoint an east wind to blow? You ever thought about that? Did he need to appoint an east wind to blow? I'm pretty convinced that it was to provide a way for them to see this deliverance as something other than from God, if that's what they wanted to do. If they wanted to reject God, okay, here, explain away. We have people today trying to say it wasn't the Red Sea, it was the Reed Sea. It's a mistranslation. It wasn't miraculous because the Reed Sea dries up. You know what my response to the first person that presented that to me was? Well, the very next verse says the Egyptian army drowned. So there's the miracle that he took a dry sea and made it full of water and drowned people. Yes, sir. There's a lot of people.
If you've driven 100 head of cattle through all these spots, you know that it's impassable in just a few minutes. Can you imagine how dry it had to be for all those people to cross and it not become bald?
Or how God made that not an issue. It doesn't matter how we talk about it. There are issues that arise from this when you look at it from a naturalistic standpoint. Any way that you go. Here's the thing about it. Okay, he appointed an east wind to blow. East wind blows all the time. How come the Red Sea doesn't continue to part occasionally? Where people are just walking by and go, hey, look at that. There's a path through the sea. Because the wind's blowing at just the right angle that day. Just because he made an east wind blow doesn't mean that the wind was what parted the waters. You know what parted the waters? God. Could he have used the wind to do it? Yeah. Does it matter? No. Did he need the wind to do it? Not any more than he does when he tells the sea, you can go this far and no further. And so that you don't think that it's because the land is higher than the sea. Before he created the seas, guess what? Water covered the entire surface of the earth. So when he pulled them back into their place, and he said, this is as far as you go, they still to this day honor that. And do you know what? There's only been one time in history when that's been released, and it created a global flood. That's the power of God over his creation. You go this far, and that's as far as you go. This is where the sea stops. This is where the land is. And so, when you get to the Red Sea, if God wants dry land to appear for his people to walk over, all he has to do is tell the water, you go this far and no further.
Yeah, you can't imagine if wind could have done that. God didn't by himself without any help or anything else, because when he parted, he didn't have a wind to blow it out of the way. When he parted the sea for them to go through.
Right. And clearly the wind obeys his voice. There's a good lesson. We learn that again with Jesus, don't we? When the wind's blowing, Jesus says, peace, be still, and it stops. We see the power of God in all of these things. And so we have to understand as we read these things, the process that he uses, there's something to learn from it. It's not important, I don't think, in the sense of he couldn't have done it any other way. It's important in the sense of he's trying to get us to understand something about himself. He's trying to get us to be able to see something that otherwise we may not see. And by the way, Jonah missed out on some of this. Because he actually thought that he could get far enough away from Israel that God wouldn't have any control over him. He didn't quite understand how universal the power of God was being displayed here. Yes, sir. Mr. John, do you have a comment?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, he tells them, I'm going to rain bread. The people shall gather a day's bread that I tested with their walk on my lawn. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So, before the Sabbath, they were to gather twice as much. Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, at evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Look, they should have known that already, right? However, God, in his infinite patience, is going to give them another lesson about his power. And consequently, us another lesson about his power. And the way he uses his power. He's not using his power to destroy them here. He's using his power to do what? To sustain them. And he's doing it at a time when they are openly rebellious and grumbling and complaining about what he's done. I wish I was still in Egypt and I had been left there. That's what they said. You know what they're saying when they say that? God was wrong to bring us out here, and God wasn't helping us. He brought us here to die. He didn't bring us here to live. He brought us here to die. How many people think that God gives us instructions to lead us to death? And so he is teaching them something about all of this. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us? Now there's two things to notice there. The earlier passage, what is that? Verse 2, the congregation grumbled against Moses and Aaron. But he says, when he's talking to them, you're grumbling against the Lord. And then the very next statement, for what are we that you grumble against us? In other words, he's trying to get them to understand something. Moses is not acting from his own authority. Moses is not saying to them, hey, I'm smarter than you, I'm stronger than you, I'm better than you, I can find you a way out, I can lead you to safety. What is Moses doing? He's simply speaking for God. And so when you grumble against what Moses has said, Not the person Moses. I don't know. Maybe he was a hard man to get along with, and there's some things you could grumble about. Maybe he was rude sometimes. And maybe you have a right to go, it was kind of rude. But when he was speaking the words of God, to grumble against those words was not to grumble against Moses, but was to grumble against God. There's something important for us to learn in that too. Extremely important. We need to respect what God has said, no matter who's saying it. We need to respect what God has said, because that reflects upon our respect of God, not our respect of the individual. And so, as we go through this, he says, let's go to verse 8. Moses said, "When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him. What are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord." He tells them that again. Repeat yourself. That's usually what? Because it's important. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling." By the way, we got some soon-to-be parents in here, but we've also got a lot of long-time experienced parents in here. Do you tend to provide your children what they're asking for when they are grumbling about it? See, let's all be honest. We've got to be completely honest. But no, the answer to that is no. When they're grumbling and complaining, you make them wait. And you try to get them to the point that they have more appreciation of things, because you're afraid that you're going to reward them for bad behavior, right? You don't want to reward them. You don't want to teach them that all they have to do is come whine and cry, and you'll give them what they want. But look at what God did here. When these people are grumbling and complaining against him and challenging him and saying that he brought them out there today, you know what he does? He feeds them. Now, I will say this. He does make them wait a little bit, right? He says, tomorrow. He doesn't give them food right away. He doesn't satiate them or satisfy them immediately. He says, wait. Tomorrow, this is what's going to happen. This is what you need to do. And by the way, he makes it conditional when he does that, because what if they didn't get up and go out to gather the manna? They would still be hungry. So he made it conditional as well. He always does that. So, despite the fact that they didn't deserve it, tell me if you start noticing a pattern. Despite the fact that they didn't deserve it, he provided sustenance for them as long as they waited for that sustenance and they went out and got it the way that he told them to get it. Does that sound familiar at all? Take this out of the realm of the flesh and talk about the spirit. God is concerned about our spiritual life. He knows that sin relegates us to death. He provides what we need in order to be delivered from sin, but we have to do what? We have to be patient and wait. And we have to get up and do the things that he's told us to do in order to gain the sustenance that he's providing. There's a reason that he does it this way, so that we understand the value in not growing weary in well-doing and persevering in the practice of the faith and trusting what he said. And even though we haven't entered the rest yet, we haven't seen the fruit of salvation in its fullness yet, we still continue to get up every day and do what he said, because we trust him and we know he will do what he has said. I mentioned this before. When I was baptized, I didn't look around and see all my sins floating in the baptistry. But you know what? I believed that they were forgiven. Why? Because I trusted him. That is what he's trying to find out. Do these people trust me or not? They're complaining. They're saying, I brought them out here to starve. Okay, I'm going to tell them. I'm going to tell them that I did not bring them out here to starve. I'm going to show them yet again what I am doing for them, and I'm going to do it in this way if they'll get up in the morning, and if they'll go out, and if they'll gather, and if they'll do it the way that I told them to do it, then they will be provided. But if they don't follow the rules, what happens? We're going to find out in just a minute. All right, verse 13, in the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. There's a great story about the quail. I love the quail story. They grumble about that later too. Anyway, quail came up and covered the camp in the morning, and dew lay around the camp, and when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it's the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. I'm with them, by the way. I would not look at something that's described that way on the ground and go, hey, there's that bread that he was talking about. That also teaches us an important lesson. You know what that is? God's promises don't always fit our conception of what they should be. God's promises fit what? His will. I don't get to decide what salvation should look like. I don't get to decide what it should mean to be a Christian. I don't get to decide how easy my life should be. I don't get to decide those things. I don't get to decide that, oh, well, God didn't do this because this doesn't appear the way that I think it ought to appear. I need to learn what? God said he would do something. This is what he did. Therefore what? This is exactly what God said. What is this? Well, that's the bread God promised you. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall take an omer, according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. So you get an omer for each person. People of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. God doesn't provide necessarily excess. God provides what? What I need. Whether I need more, whether I need less, doesn't matter. If I do it God's way, I have all that I need. Which is why we're told in the New Testament to do what? To be content in whatever circumstances we're in. Moses said to them, if I believe God, I learn to be content. Even when it's not the way I think it ought to be or I think it ought to look, I need to learn to be content. Because when he says he's going to provide all the food that I need, I'm going to get all the food that I need. Sometimes our eyes are bigger than our stomach, right? We think we need more, we pile it on the plate, we get full, we can't finish it. Not the way it works with God. Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over till morning. All right, so here's the first problem. What do human beings do? We hoard. Hey, wait a minute. What if I don't have enough tomorrow? Large part for that very reason, because we might need to use that. By the way, I'm not saying leftovers are evil. I'm just saying I don't like them. Let none of it be left over till the morning. They did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. That's what happens when we cheat, when we don't listen to God, when we don't believe his word. It turns wormy and stinky. So the next time you open up your life and it's wormy and stinky, it's probably not because you did what God told you to do. It's probably because of what? You didn't listen. How hard is that? Don't keep any of it. And yet, they didn't listen. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. So you could only do it in the morning, What happened if you were a late sleeper? You didn't get to eat. If a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. So if you want to eat, then you get up in the morning, and as soon as the dew is dry and you can get out and work, you go out there and you collect what you need for the day, because by noon it's gone. So work while it is day, because night is coming when no man works. See, there's a lesson in this. When do we prepare for salvation? Now. That is, if we want to be prepared. If we're happy to go through eternity in damnation, then you don't have to prepare now. He's not going to make you do it. But if you want the eternal life that He promised, then you get up and work when He tells you to work. And then He provides what He promised He would provide. On the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, by the way, to make this clear, just in case anybody misreads any of this, when it talks some more, some less, that's based on how many people are in the tent. It was an omer per person, and an omer filled up everyone, even the people who had larger appetites or the people who had less appetite. An omer satisfied their need. That was exactly what they needed. So that's what they did. They gathered 2 omers on the sixth day, so they didn't have to do it on the Sabbath. And He said, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow's a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside and keep till morning. How this was prepared, I have no idea. I'm not even going to pretend to understand all that. I'm assuming from this verse that what they collected off the ground was not the final form that they ate, that they had to prepare it some way, and that it could be boiled and made into something, or it could be baked. And I'm going to guess that, I'm just guessing, I don't have anything to work off of other than the way grain reacts. And if you boil grain, it turns into a porridge, soupy stuff. And if you bake it, you can turn it into a baked loaf of some sort. So you can make cornbread or you can make grits. I don't know exactly, but it indicates to me that they had to prepare this. That also tells me something about it. There's work involved. You don't just get to eat. You had to actually take what He gave you and manipulate it and do something with it to make it useful. So they laid it. I think a lot of times we read that God's going to provide. We want it just to be laying there in front of us. I know this is a true story. People came to a congregation where I was preaching at the time. One of the elders brought them to a grocery store. They were hungry. It was a whole family. And he had decided out of the goodness of his heart that he was going to walk them through the grocery store, let them fill up a grocery cart, and just pay a grocery bill for them. So they just had however much food that they wanted. He wasn't putting any limits on it. About halfway through the shopping experience, the lady looks at him and says, I'm going to have to take all this home and cook it. I really think you ought to buy us a hot meal. Guess what he did? He put everything back, and he sent them on their way. I think he didn't do something wrong. I think he was doing exactly what God does. They were expected to work and use the things that God gave them to provide for themselves. And this again goes into what we learn later: if a man doesn't work, neither let him eat, and all these other principles, I believe, that are laws because they're teaching us that there is something to do. Even though I'm not saving myself, I don't have the means to get rid of my sin and to gain my place in heaven. When I've done everything, I'm to say I'm an unprofitable servant. I've done only what I was told to do. I can't do anything to get rid of my sins and gain a spot in heaven, but that doesn't mean that I don't need to work with what God has done before I have the things that He promised. I think we're seeing that here. Morning by morning, they had to do this. They laid it all aside till morning, as Moses commanded them, verse 24, and it did not stink. There was no worms in it. So that stuff that they saved over from Day 6 on day 7 was still good. There you go. It's not a natural aspect of what manna was that made it grow worms and stink in 24 hours. It was God saying, do what I told you to do. That was a discipline. The smell and the worms was a discipline. When they opened it up the next day, they should have went, you know what? I really need to do what God said. Now I got to clean this mess up. Moses said, eat it today, for today is the Sabbath of the Lord. You will not find it in the field. I wonder how many people went out that first 7th day going, where's it at? 6 days you shall gather, but on the 7th, which is the Sabbath, there will be none on the 7th day. Some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. I don't know how many it was, but some of them. Some of them did it. Guess what? I ain't going to say it wouldn't have been me if I was there. That's an arrogant position. But looking back on it, it does look foolish, doesn't it? So, oh yeah. Did he really mean that? You ever heard anybody express that attitude or ever felt that way yourself? I wonder if he really meant that. I wonder if that's what he really meant. Yep, that's what he meant. Just think about those things. I'm out of time. I wanted to finish this, but there's good stuff here. It's just rich. And I want you to understand something. We're looking at this primarily just from the initial story. There is a whole nother level of teaching that comes from this that we don't find out about until much later in the story of the revelation of God. Got to stop. Thanks for your presence and participation. Lots of good comments today.